Hello and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran, bringing you episode 82 of season 2. In the last episode, titled The Catechism of War, I talked about the motivation for the Bijapur Sultanate eyeing Bengaluru as their prized possession, and how the coming battle showcased the difference between Persian and South Indian war ideologies. In this episode, how did all that play out on the field? The campaign, the tactics, and the inevitable intrigues. But before I get into all that, first, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Only to keep the narrative in memory, a quick recap. In 1636, Aurangzeb had signed a treaty with Adil Shah of Bijapur. One of the clauses prevented Bijapur from trying to extend its borders towards the north into Mughal-owned or Mughal-dominated territories. That was in 1636, but years before, after permanently solving the problem of Vijayanagara, Bijapur had settled back into dealing with its other routine problems. Its neighbors were the other four Bahmani breakaways, and from the north, the overwhelming presence of the Mughals. Until 1636, almost a century after the sack of Vijayanagara, things were still unsettled. Generations may have passed, new people, same problems. So in 1636, things changed. Ahmednagar became a part of the Mughal Empire, and a treaty of peace was signed between the Mughals and Bijapur, and this treaty with Aurangzeb gave the centuries-old problem a new definition. A definition that became the national objective for Bijapur. If they could not campaign in the north, then they must campaign in the south. And that is what led them to Bengaluru. But their first target was not Bengaluru. It was Adoni in Andhra Pradesh, which is about 350 kilometers from Bengaluru. It's about 75 kilometers north of Ballari. The other target they had was the town of Tadipatri, southwest of Adoni, closer to Anantapur. So in early 1638, the Bijapur army was assembled, and they started their 250-kilometer march from Bijapur towards Adoni. 40,000 cavalry, 100,000 infantry, a long train of elephants. Marching at the head of the army was its supreme commander, the much-titled Ranadulla Khan, and assisting him as the second-in-command was the battle-hardened Maratha, Shahaji Bhonsle, the father of Shivaji. The Bijapur campaign objective was clear: take Tadipatri and Adoni. These would become a base for the next expansion. But before any battle with Adoni happened, plans changed and the entire Bijapur army redirected themselves and marched to Bengaluru. This merits a closer look. What happened? What changed? It turns out that it was the result of a conspiracy, and at the center of that conspiracy was one man. This man was Kenga Nayaka of Basavapatna, and that is the region slightly south of Hassan. Kenga Nayaka had attached himself to this particular Bijapur military campaign as an advisor and as a local guide. Kenga Nayaka's entry into the Bijapur orbit had begun a year earlier when he had petitioned Muhammad Adil Shah for military assistance against his feudal rival, the Nayakavi Keri. That campaign was conducted well, and Kenga had proved pretty useful to the Bijapur Sultanate. Now he was traveling with the main army in the capacity of someone who knew the terrain, the routes, the water sources, the language, the politics of the plateau. Again, the Bijapur army's original objectives were Adoni and Tadipatri, and Ranadulla's orders were very, very clear. Those were the targets. But Kenga Nayaka also had a close relationship with the Padegar of Tadipatri, and a meeting happened between them. Tadipatri knew that he did not stand a chance against the mighty Bijapur army, and he needed to find a way to avoid it. So he made the argument to Kenga Nayaka that if Adoni and Tadipatri fell to Bijapur, so would the entire northern part of the southern Deccan, and this would be no good for either of them. He conspired with Kenga Nayaka, and they came up with a plan to distract Ranadulla Khan. Forget Tadipatri. There's another city, rich and waiting to be plundered. It's called Bengaluru. Now pause on this for a moment. The Palegar of Tadipatri was asking Kenga Nayaka to redirect 140,000 strong Bijapur army away from his own city and towards Bengaluru instead. And Kenga Nayaka obliged. He went to Ranadulla Khan with a suggestion. Ranadulla saw the sense in this argument and he referred it to Adil Shah. Some records suggest that Adil Shah might anyway have had Bengaluru in his crosshairs and he readily sent his approval. So the orders were changed and the great army of Bijapur turned south. One city was saved, another city was about to be sacrificed, simply by a conversation between two friends. But Kenga Nayaka was not finished. He asked Ranadulla Khan for Sira. It's a principality about 125 kilometers northwest of Bengaluru. It's near Tumakuru. Ranadulla agreed. He detached a division under one of his generals, Afzal Khan, to take the Sira fort. That campaign started to happen on the side, but Sira was taken dishonorably. After some resistance, the local Nayaka, Kasturi Ranga, came out to negotiate with Afzal Khan. But against all norms of military courtesy, Afzal Khan killed him. The fort resisted briefly, but soon it fell, and Sira was handed over to Kenga Nayaka. The main army, with Kenga Nayaka, continued its march southwards towards Bengaluru. Kenga Nayaka may have betrayed a fellow Vijayanagara Palegar and sold him out to Ranadulla on the job. He had arrived at this campaign with nothing but local knowledge and a petition, and now he was leaving it, or so he expected, with a fort of his own. The march to Bengaluru wound its way through Bankapura, Harihara and Tankere, and now it spilled into the Mysore plateau. The army assaulted as it went. Ramagiri and Tumakuru were subdued, and they made camp at Shivaganga within striking distance of Bengaluru. Now, the army's march was quite the march. The 17th century Kannada poet Govinda Vaidya, in his poem Kantirava Narsaraja Vijayam, left us with a description of this army on the move that is unlike anything a military historian could write. Vaidya was not interested so much in the cannons and the cavalry, those were regular stuff. He paid attention mostly to the women accompanying the army. The Bijapur army traveled, as by the old Persian traditions, with its entire social world in tow. Now, this was not incidental, it was completely deliberate. This was their norm, this was their practice. They called it the Raab, which means awe, dread, or overwhelming, all-consuming fear. An army that brings its household, its harems, its entertainers, is an army that has not come to raid. It is an army that has come to stay, and that alone should strike fear in the hearts of the enemy. The Bibis, the ladies of the household of the generals, were carried in howdahs on top of the elephants with great care and what Vaidya describes as sumanna, or happiness. The Vallabhairu, the favored wives, followed in palanquins, and then came the Sulayaru. In modern Kannada, that would be prostitutes, but in those days, it included the concubines and the dancing girls, to whom Vaidya devotes a remarkable number of verses. He describes their beauty, their jasmine garlands, their fine saris, their jewelry, the gem-studded earrings, bracelets, pearl necklaces, finger rings, waistbands. But what really captured his attention was their professional skill. They used games of dice and chess as pretext to draw men in and strip them of all their valuables. According to Vaidya, the Sule would pretend to weep and fast, claiming that she could not eat for the love of a particular man, and trick him into giving her a large sum of money. Vaidya compares their homes to that of a spider's web, a net of Mandana, a god of love, designed to capture and bind men who stumble into it like a herd of deer. Vaidya's description tells us as much about the social world of a 17th century military campaign as any battle account could. By the time this rather interesting procession reached the outskirts of Bengaluru, the effect was exactly as by the Persian Catechism of War. People living on the city's outer periphery fled into the woods, and they dug pits in which they hid their valuables. The inhabitants of the Pete crowded into the fort. Their terror at learning of the massive army at their doorstep needed no exaggerated descriptions. They only had to look. Their only hope was the fort's massive gates. the deep water-filled moat, the bramble planted in the water, and the soldiers of Immadi Kempe Gowda. But what chance could this have against a highly trained Mughal army expressed in the form of the Bijapur soldiers? Let's find out after this commercial break, and when I'm back, I will tell you all about it. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
When the Bijapur army made its camp before Bengaluru, it did so with the unhurried confidence of a force that knew how this was going to end. The Padegars of Hoskote and the others in the alliance would assist with local logistics and supply, feed the army, so the army could wait. When the Bijapur army made its camps outside Bengaluru, it did so with the unhurried confidence of a force that knew how this was going to end. The Padegars of Hoskote and the others who were against Bengaluru, and they were part of the alliance, would assist with local logistics and supply. So therefore the army could wait. There was no way that Bengaluru could last in a long siege. And then Kenga Nayaka, who was clearly not the most honorable of men, made his next move. Even at this moment on the eve of the siege, Kenga suddenly decided that he was not fully committed against Immadi Kempe Gowda. He had guided the Bijapur army there. He had secured Sira for himself on the basis of leading the Bijapur army to a victory against Bengaluru. But he had not yet technically crossed the line that made him irrevocably an enemy of the man inside the fort. So, he suddenly crossed over to the other side instead. Before the siege began, Kenga Nayaka detached himself from the Bijapur camp and entered the Bengaluru Pete with his followers, presenting himself as an ally of Kempe Gowda. His forces, said to consist of 30,000 troops, now strengthened the garrison within the fort. The implications of this were significant. 30,000 additional men changed the entire calculus of the defense. It did not make victory a certainty for the Bijapur army now, but it made the siege more expensive, more prolonged, and more uncertain. And these are things that would want to make the Bijapur army not take the step towards the siege. Ranadulla looked at this from the other side of the walls, and he made his own assessment. He was not surprised. He had been watching Kenga Nayaka too long and knew how this man operated. But he also knew that there was a price that Kenga Nayaka put on everything. So he simply made him a better offer, imperial favors, a guaranteed reward, a prominent position in the new order that was going to come regardless of what happened with Bengaluru. So what did Kenga Nayaka do? He flipped again. He withdrew his men from the fort and crossed back into the Bijapur camp. This reverse defection was not merely a military event. It was psychologically damaging. The garrison inside the fort would have watched as 30,000 men walked out. Whatever hope had been kindled when Kenga Nayaka arrived was now extinguished. Usually when this sort of thing happens, one feels worse. The message to every soldier on those walls inside the fort was clear. Their cause was lost. And the morale inside the Bengaluru fort completely collapsed. The siege of Bengaluru lasted 3 days. On the first day, Immadi Kempe Gowda ordered a sally, which is a probing attack outside the walls. A sally is a sudden strike launched by defenders from inside a fort. The gates open, and then a small cavalry force rides out fast, hits hard, and withdraws before the enemy can respond fully. This is meant to test strength, disrupt any siege works in process, force the enemy to reveal their formations, and show a certain amount of confidence in saying that if you attack us, this is how we're going to respond. A commander who orders a sally is signaling that he is not going to simply wait behind those walls. He will choose when the fight begins. Sallies are designed to test, to gather information, to buy time for the war council to think. But what the soldiers of the Sali brought back from the probe must have been sobering. The Bijapur forces were not a force that could be tested or delayed. They looked to be well positioned, with the systematic precision of an army that was experienced and knew exactly what they were doing. The second day dawned, and it brought what the accounts describe as a heroic fight. The defenders of Bengaluru fort held their ground. They fought against heavy odds with the weapons they had. But the Bijapur army had brought a park of fine artillery and battering rams. The fort was made of mud. Its moat and bramble could deter cavalry charges, but it could not stop sustained artillery from heavy cannons. On the third day, the gates were battered. Now the walls showed sign of breach. And here, again, Kenga Nayaka reappears for the third time in this episode. Having served as a guide, secret negotiator, ally, defector, reverse defector, he now presented himself as a peacemaker. He first went to Ranadulla Khan. "Do not press the final assault," he said. "Your soldiers are wounded and exhausted. Instead, I will go to Kempe Gowda. I will negotiate a surrender." Ranadulla Khan, who wanted the city intact, its revenues undamaged, of course, he agreed. So, Kenga Nayaka went to Kempe Gowda with an argument that was both true and it was brutal. He said to him that continued resistance was futile. The Bijapur forces had time and resources, Bengaluru did not. Further fighting would only increase losses without changing the outcome. The city and its people would suffer for nothing. Immedi Kempe Gowda knew this already, so he raised the white flag, a sign to open discussions. Now, most people think that a white flag, which literally can be a white-colored piece of cloth, is a sign of surrender. But it isn't. In military convention, a white flag is a request to cease fire and talk. It gives the losing side the chance to extract terms before the final assault. This works. Nobody wants a war to continue. People need the war to end quickly, one way or the other. So Kempe Gowda decided to use the white flag to negotiate, and then he struck a deal with Bijapur. First, he paid a large tribute, and that tribute included Bengaluru. The transfer was orderly. There was no sack, there was no burning, no destruction of the infrastructure. The Bijapur Sultanate wanted a revenue-producing city, not a ruin. And then Immedi Kempe Gowda walked out of the fort. His destiny had held for over a century, and formally he handed Bengaluru to Ranadulla Khan. But he didn't walk out empty-handed, because Bijapur had a policy to allow vanquished chiefs to retain less productive parts of their territory. They believed that these kinds of things would ensure regional stability. So Kempe Gowda was given Magadi and Samanadurga to keep, and it is to that location that he moved. It is at this point in time that the Kempe Gowdas started to be referred to as the Magadi Kempe Gowdas. Until then, they weren't. And what happened next is another turning point in Bengaluru's history. In appreciation for Shahaji Bhonsle's contribution to the war effort, Adil Shah handed him Bengaluru and 12 Hublis as his jagir. And now Shahaji was left in Bangalore to manage the city for the Sultanate. And at that point, for all practical purposes, Bengaluru was under Maratha rule. The fort changed hands, the flag changed, the markets did not close, the temples continued to function, the accounts were kept, life went on. The city had been built by immigrants. Over a century had gone by. There was more than one generation, sometimes more than 3 generations in between. And the existing generations of this time held no attachment to any particular ruler. They were there for the business opportunity, and that is what the Pete provided. They had absorbed the traditions, they did not want any rupture, and for them, one ruler was just as good as the next. And now we must take a moment to think about Kenga Nayaka. He was the man who saved Tadipatri, secured Sira for himself, defected to Bengaluru, defected back to Bijapur, and then negotiated a peace treaty and prevented the sack of Bengaluru. History does not judge Kenga Nayaka kindly. They judge him for his fluid loyalties. But if we look at it from another way, maybe we should reconsider that. 3 cities had been preserved: Bengaluru, Adoni, and Tadipatri. No war, no loss of lives. Of course, we need to take Sira into all this calculus. So, whatever be the motives, these were the outcomes, and on the balance, Kenga Nayaka actually pulled off something very smart. The Kempe Gowda era in Bangalore was over. The Maratha years began. Shahaji Bhonsle settled in the Pete, where he set up a sort of a palace, and that building still exists. If you follow me on Instagram, keep an eye. I will take you to that location very soon. But the bigger story here is that the Kempe Gowda family were no longer in charge of Bengaluru, and that era had ended. What I told you about was the Second Battle of Bengaluru, and because of its success, from now on, all Bengaluru faced from time and time again was battle after battle. But right now, it changed to the extent that it passed into Maratha's hands. And that era starts in the next episode. Coming up really soon, watch the space. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.